story is set in September 2012 in Scotland, when Chris Lemons, a team of saturation divers tasked with maintaining an undersea gas line, visits his fiancée Morag. He tells her he will return to work with his team the next day and assures her everything will be fine.
Yeah, you'll get them.
The next day, Chris went to the docks and boarded the ship he was working on. There, he is warmly welcomed by his colleagues, especially by Duncan, his best friend and the person who already considers Chris like his own son. Shortly after, their boss, Craig, informed them that they would enter a hyperbaric chamber for 28 days before being lowered to 300 feet to replace an undersea gas pipe. Craig divided them into 3 teams, each consisting of 3 people. Chris joined Team A along with Duncan and Dave. After completing the division, all team members immediately went to their respective places. After everyone had settled into their places, the ship began to sail away from the dock towards the waters of Aberdeen in northeast Scotland. On the way, Duncan said that given his age, this would be his last assignment before retirement. Chris was a little disappointed that Duncan hadn't told him before. However, Duncan calmed him down and said that Chris would be fine without him, as he is now a great diver. After a few days of sailing, they finally reached their destination, and the first team to be deployed was Team A, Chris's team. After reaching 300 feet, Dave began to descend, followed by Chris. Duncan, meanwhile, did not go down, as he was tasked with monitoring them and organizing the distribution of umbilical hoses that supply electrical communication and oxygen. Dave and Chris were known to work underwater for 6 hours without surfacing. Arriving at the seabed, Chris and Dave went straight to the manifold and turned on the electricity. Once the lights were on, they entered the manifold and started working. However, as Chris and Dave began their task, their ship's dynamic positioning system malfunctioned, and the ship moved away from the work site.
I'm getting the same here, Captain.
Seeing the situation, Dave told Chris to get out and climb onto the diving bell where Duncan was waiting. Dave managed to climb the diving bell, but Chris struggled as the safety line connecting him was snagged. Meanwhile, the ship continued to move away from the site. As the ship moved forward uncontrollably, Chris's safety line finally snapped. But before that, Dave told Chris that when he was at the bottom of the sea, Chris should try to find the manifold so that he could be easily found and rescued. Seeing that one of Chris's safety lines was broken, Duncan felt very anxious. Shortly afterwards, Dave, who had managed to climb up, appeared and told him that Chris had fallen to the bottom of the sea because his safety line was snagged. Hearing the news, Duncan was sorrowful. Meanwhile, in the wheelhouse, Craig urged the captain to lower the anchor to stop the ship. However, the captain refused because their position was close to various gas lines. And if the anchor hit one of the pipes, it could cause an environmental disaster. Meanwhile, Chris, who was lost at the bottom of the sea, finally found the manifold where he was working and tried to climb up to the diving bell as Dave directed, so that he could be easily found and rescued. However, before he could climb up, Chris had fallen unconscious. Before losing consciousness, he recalled a video recording from his fiancée, in which she expressed concern about the work he was doing, given the risks and the lives at stake. However, Chris felt he couldn't leave his job because he needed the money for his marriage and their future together. To immediately rescue Chris, one of the crew members, Jack, attempted to forcefully reset the DPS system by changing the cable so that the ship's thrusters could be automatically operated again. Meanwhile, another crew member named Max tried to locate Chris using an ROV. When Max spotted Chris on the manifold, Craig was relieved. Craig explained that Chris was having convulsions due to a lack of oxygen in the brain. Then, Craig, responsible for diver safety, asked Max to lift Chris using the ROV, but Max refused because the risk was too great. Because of this responsibility, Craig finally took control and tried to lift Chris with the ROV. Unfortunately, after reaching Chris's body, Craig was unable to lift him because Chris had tied his body to the manifold to prevent himself from drifting away while unconscious. While waiting for the DPS system to be repaired, Duncan told Dave that a year ago, he and Chris had participated in an operation to rescue a fisherman who had sunk with his boat. Of the many divers involved, only Duncan and Chris could dive for a long time to finally find the fisherman and his boat. While Jack struggled, he finally reset the DPS system so that the ship's thrusters could be operated automatically. After that, they immediately returned to the location where Chris was trapped. Dave immediately went down to rescue Chris. Arriving at the top of the manifold, Dave immediately helped Chris and tried to bring him up with all his might. Although he felt overwhelmed because Chris was very heavy, thanks to Duncan's direction and encouragement, Dave finally managed to bring Chris up. Upon arrival, a worried Duncan immediately tried to resuscitate Chris until he started breathing again. This made Duncan feel relieved and grateful because he thought Chris should have died. Then Duncan and Dave tried to talk to Chris, but Chris did not respond, leaving them sad and thinking that Chris might have suffered severe brain damage due to a lack of oxygen for about 40 minutes. But while they were grieving, Chris suddenly started talking. The incident made Duncan, Dave, and everyone on the ship very happy because their efforts to save Chris were not in vain. Because of this incident, they decided to go home first and resume work after Chris fully recovers. When examined, it turned out that Chris recovered quickly, which surprised Dave. Chris then tells them that after being awakened by Duncan, he was conscious and heard what they said, but he chose not to answer because his girlfriend's concerns about his job were about to come true. Chris still couldn't leave his job because he needed the money. He was also very grateful to Dave for saving his life. After the conversation, Dave felt sad because he remembered his 2 daughters who were left behind. Chris told his girlfriend he was going home soon because his ship had problems, so work had to be postponed. A few days later, Chris finally arrived at the port and immediately went to see his fiancée Morag. Chris told her about his bad experience. Hearing this, Morag was very sad and asked Chris to quit his job. But Chris assured her everything would be fine because he was still alive. 3 weeks after the accident, Chris and Duncan returned to work to complete a previously delayed task. Their work is now completed smoothly and without a hitch. After the work is done, Chris gets married to Morag, and the movie ends.